U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 35% tariff on Canadian goods to go into effect on August 1st.
Tariffs are having a real impact right here in the Treasure State, with farmers and ranchers feeling it firsthand.
35% tariff is now in place on some Canadian goods. And one Canadian industry that Washington has taken particular issue with is dairy.
Everything had been meticulously prepared since early August 2025. Washington was looking to change the rules of trade, but Canada wasn't about to let that happen. Lawmakers in Ottawa decisively ended all negotiations, leaving American farmers staring at empty barns, wondering who would buy their milk. The message from the White House was unmistakable. The U.S. wanted to reset the terms of trade to its own advantage, no matter the impact on others. But this time, Canada held its ground. Rather than giving in, Canadian leaders stood firm to defend their farmers, workers, and industries. Negotiations ground to a halt. Trade at the border slowed to a near stop. Export contracts were delayed or canceled altogether. For many in rural America, where livelihoods relied on steady dairy exports to Canada, the consequences were immediate. Milk that once flowed across the border now sat unused, quickly becoming a burden. In contrast, Canadian farmers united, supported strongly by their government. They worked not only to protect their domestic market, but also to expand into new regions beyond the U.S. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a clear statement that Canada would not be pushed into a corner. Rather than giving in to U.S. pressure, Ottawa began redefining Canada's place in North America's supply chain, powered by national determination and unity. Most Canadian exports to the U.S. are not affected by the new tariffs. Canada successfully secured exemptions for goods that comply with the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA. According to the Bank of Canada, 95% of Canadian exports remain tariff-free. Even when including all exports to the U.S., exempt and otherwise, Canadian producers are paying just 2.3% to 5% in tariffs on average. Yet President Donald Trump chose an unexpected battleground to apply pressure: the dairy sector. U.S. officials viewed Canada's supply management system as a symbol of trade imbalance. But in Ottawa, the view was entirely different. Dairy is more than just a product. It supports thousands of farm families, sustains rural communities, and forms a key part of Canada's economic identity. Canada was not willing to allow it to be undermined. To Americans, Canada's dairy supply management is seen as a barrier to free trade, an invisible wall. But in Canada, it's viewed as a stabilizing force that protects against overproduction crises and guarantees fair income for farmers. When Trump targeted the dairy sector to reclaim perceived advantages, Canada drew a hard line. This was about more than economics. It was a question of sovereignty, of who gets to decide the future of Canadian agriculture. Ottawa made its position clear. It would not be bullied by Washington, no matter the pressure. If anyone believed Canada would give in by attacking what matters most to its people, they clearly underestimated their opponent. Prime Minister Mark Carney expressed disappointment in Trump's actions, posting on X, "We will continue to negotiate with the United States on our trading relationship. The Canadian government is laser-focused on what we can control, building Canada strong." Experts say the new tariffs may be part of a U.S. strategy to pressure Canada into a deal. But this isn't just about milk or butter. It's about strategy, sovereignty, and the future of trade between two close neighbors. As new tariffs roll out and tensions rise, the industry watches carefully to see which side will give in first. This is a battle of endurance, with real consequences for farmers, businesses, and consumers on both sides of the border. President Trump has also been spreading misleading claims about Canadian dairy tariffs. He said the first little carton of milk is cheap, but then the tariffs skyrocket to 275 to 300%. That's simply not true. Under the very trade deal Trump's first administration negotiated, the USMCA, Canada agreed to allow tens of thousands of metric tons of U.S. dairy imports tariff-free. Not low tariffs, zero. And currently, the U.S. isn't even using half of that duty-free quota. So those high tariffs only apply above that threshold, and right now, they're not even active. For American farmers, used to price instability and overproduction, Trump's move was seen as a potential turning point, an opportunity to gain some control over their market. They hoped it might stabilize incomes and offer relief from ongoing economic uncertainty. Meanwhile, for Canadian farmers, supply management isn't just a policy, it's a way of life. It shields them from market chaos, secures fair returns, and helps sustain rural communities. Two nations, two viewpoints, and two vastly different paths forward. Trump claimed Canada was charging over 200% in dairy tariffs, and that under his leadership it was taken care of, only for things to worsen under Biden. He called Canada very difficult to deal with. But the numbers don't support his claims. With tension still rising, one question remains. Will Trump's tariffs be enough to shake Canada's resolve? Or will U.S. farms ultimately suffer from a fight they never wanted? And despite all the loud claims, it's important to remember, those high Canadian tariffs only kick in after imports cross agreed limits, and those limits haven't even been reached. Beneath the import threshold, there are no tariffs at all, and that threshold hasn't even been reached. Still, Trump and his administration repeatedly criticized Canadian dairy policies. At the center of their frustration, Canada's supply management system, one of the most tightly controlled agricultural systems in the world, and the backbone of the Canadian dairy sector for over 60 years. Here's how it works. The federal government sets strict limits on how much milk, cheese, butter, and other dairy products can be produced domestically. At the same time, imports are capped at just 3.5% of national consumption. On top of those limits, massive tariffs, such as 241% on milk and nearly 398% on butter, create a formidable barrier to foreign competition. But these numbers aren't arbitrary. The system is carefully structured to maintain price stability, ensure farmers earn a reliable income, and protect rural communities from being wiped out by global market forces. Unlike the US, where large-scale industrial farms with tens of thousands of cows dominate, Canada's dairy industry is based on small, family-run farms focused on domestic needs and long-term sustainability. And this isn't just about policy. The supply management system enjoys broad political backing. From Quebec to British Columbia, across party lines, there's a strong consensus. Supply management is something Canada must protect. Just before Trump's administration increased tariffs yet again, Canadian lawmakers took a bold step. They passed legislation that prohibits future governments from using supply management as a bargaining tool in trade talks. For Ottawa, dairy isn't just a commodity. It's a national symbol, deeply tied to rural livelihoods, community well-being, and pride in agricultural self-reliance. But the perspective is very different south of the border. In the United States, dairy producers consistently generate more than the domestic market can consume. This chronic oversupply drags prices down and drives many farmers toward financial ruin, burdened with rising costs and debt. For them, exports aren't optional, they're essential. Canada, with its close proximity and strong buying power, naturally looks like a lifeline. But Canada's tight restrictions make access extremely limited. Still, U.S. companies managed to sell over $800 million worth of dairy products into the Canadian market annually, far more than the $300 million in Canadian dairy exports that make it into the U.S. To Washington, this is clear evidence of an unfair imbalance. To many American farmers, it feels like a daily loss, missed sales, limited production, and blocked opportunities caused by what they call Canada's dairy wall. Donald Trump quickly tapped into this frustration. He labeled Canada's supply management system an insult to U.S. farmers, and during campaign stops in key dairy states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, he repeatedly promised to tear down trade, barriers, and give American producers access to Canadian markets. But behind these bold promises lies a more difficult truth. Even if Canada relaxed its restrictions, U.S. farmers would still face intense competition from low-cost global producers, and their own operating costs would remain sky-high. The Canadian market, while appealing, isn't nearly big enough to solve America's deep-rooted dairy surplus. Yet, for many struggling farmers, even the hope of a small breakthrough was enough to hang on to. By August 2025, Trump had lost patience. He decided to escalate. When negotiations hit a wall and Canada refused to budge, the U.S. raised tariffs on Canadian goods that fall outside the USMCA framework, from 25% to 35%. Officially, dairy wasn't targeted. But politically, it was clear. Dairy was the heart of the conflict. Trump used these new tariffs as a pressure tactic, trying to force Canada to back down, or at least weaken its supply management system. But Ottawa was ready. Just weeks earlier, Canada had passed a law banning future governments from ever trading away supply management in international deals. The law passed with rare unity between the governing party and opposition, sending a clear and strong message to Washington. Canada would not be coerced. Trump's usual approach, hit hard, hit fast, and force the other side to retreat, had worked in places like Japan, South Korea, and even some EU countries. But Canada was a different story. In Ottawa, the fight wasn't just about economics. It was about national values, political sovereignty, and the future of thousands of small, family-owned dairy farms. Rather than retreat, Canada dug in. Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear, if forced to choose, Canada would rather walk away from the negotiating table entirely than sacrifice its dairy system. Trump's attempt to corner Canada didn't result in surrender. It triggered a prolonged and widening standoff. The tension spilled beyond dairy. Tariffs began to affect other key sectors: steel, aluminum, and eventually the auto industry. Dairy may have started the fight, but it quickly became just one piece of a much broader economic conflict. The entire structure of North America trade was suddenly under pressure. Detroit, the heart of Michigan's auto industry, was hit hard. Tariffs on some Canadian materials soared to 50%. The fallout was swift and severe. General Motors reported a $1 billion profit loss in just one quarter. Stellantis saw a $2.7 billion loss in the first half of 2025 alone. Ford hadn't yet released its financials, but analysts expected similar struggles. At first, auto companies tried to calm investors, framing the disruption as temporary. But as time passed, supply chains came under extreme strain. Virtually every car built in Michigan relied on dozens of Canadian-made components. The ripple effects were felt throughout the entire industry. From vehicle frames to specialized parts, every new tariff pushed production costs even higher. Industry analysts warned that U.S. consumers could soon be paying significantly more for cars, up to $9,000 extra in some cases. The pressure was already being felt. Affordable models started disappearing from showrooms. Electric vehicle production slowed down, and suppliers across the Midwest began cutting jobs. According to the Center for Automotive Research, if the tariffs remained in place through the end of the year, the financial toll on the auto industry could reach $18 billion. What started as a trade spat over dairy had evolved into a direct threat to one of America's most vital industries. In Detroit, the question was no longer if the tariffs would cause pain, but whether the auto sector could survive another 3 years of it. Canada had faced U.S. trade pressure before, but this time it was ready. Instead of retaliating with more tariffs, Prime Minister Mark Carney took a different route. He began rebuilding Canada's economic foundation. Ottawa made it clear there would be no negotiation over supply management. The reason was straightforward. Dairy wasn't just a product, it was part of the national fabric, not something to be traded away. Instead, Canada leaned into its strengths: energy, critical minerals, and its central role in the North American auto supply chain. Carney was blunt. Canada would not be pressured into accepting unfair deals. The new strategy focused on expanding global alliances. Canada strengthened relationships with Europe and Asia, securing early long-term agreements for goods and services. The message was simple: if access to the U.S. market was blocked, other doors would be opened. At home, the government rolled out support programs to help industries most affected by U.S. tariffs. This gave Canadian businesses the ability to shift focus, either toward domestic sales or new international markets. Instead of panicking, Canadian companies began forging new ties with major economies like South Korea, Japan, and the European Union. And the message to Washington couldn't have been clearer. Canada wouldn't be boxed in. If Trump wanted to escalate a trade fight, Canada was ready to stand its ground. The dairy dispute might have made headlines, but it was only the visible part of a much deeper standoff. Trump's strategy was familiar: move quickly, apply heavy pressure, and expect rapid concessions. Tariffs were used as bargaining chips to push trading partners toward deals. In some places, the approach worked. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and even parts of the EU had chosen compromise over escalation. Factories reopened, trade resumed, and deals were signed, just as the U.S. had intended. But Canada didn't follow that script. Ottawa's firm resistance revealed a flaw in Trump's approach. Tariffs might be effective against smaller or less integrated economies, but not against a partner like Canada, whose deep ties to U.S. supply chains meant the damage would hit both sides. While Canada absorbed the shocks with a prepared response, it was American businesses, workers, and consumers who were starting to feel the pain. Around the world, allies and rivals were paying close attention. Some friendly nations took notes, while competitors, especially China, took advantage, filling gaps and expanding influence in key sectors like minerals and energy. Meanwhile, the U.S. found itself locked in a trade conflict with its closest neighbor over dairy. What began as a disagreement over milk had become a major test of the U.S.'s new trade policy. The world was watching to see if countries would bend under pressure. Canada's answer had been a firm and consistent no. A dispute that started over something as ordinary as a carton of milk had grown into a conflict far beyond dairy. The tariffs meant to force Canada into submission were instead bouncing back into the U.S. economy. From Detroit's assembly lines to farm fields across the Midwest, and even into the aisles of grocery stores, Americans were now dealing with the consequences. Canada, for its part, never wavered. Even during the toughest moments, it refused to abandon its supply management system. Meanwhile, American farmers were left with unsold products, waiting for solutions that might never come. Industry leaders in the U.S. warned that this wasn't just about one bad quarter. This could trigger long-term damage. In contrast, Canada was strengthening its resilience. It was building new partnerships, finding new customers, and charting a more sustainable course for the future. A clear irony was beginning to emerge. The pressure campaign that was meant to break Canada appeared to be hurting the United States even more. The real question was no longer whether Canada could hold out, but whether America's farms, factories, and consumers could endure a trade war that started with nothing more than a glass of milk.